Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Philosophy in Life, presented by Dr. Andrea Baldini. We hope you guys enjoyed today's webinar. My name is Esther, and I work for the International Relations Department, and I will be the moderator for today. And I'd like to allow my colleague to introduce himself as well.
Hi, my name is Shane, and I'm a Director of International Relations Department at CSO Education Group. And thanks for joining us. I hope you'll enjoy this webinar. Thank you.
A few of you are already familiar with some of our products and services, but I will just take a moment to refresh that for some of you guys who are new with CSO. So we do provide English as a second language course, which is actually now open for registration. And in fact, both myself and my colleague here, Shane, will be teaching the course. So if that's something you're interested in joining, please do feel free to reach out to us. We are available at info@canadasummer.ca or any of our other channels. So if you are interested in joining this professional course, please do inquire, and we'd love to help you out. The other thing we also provide are online and in-person study abroad opportunities, which is actually very great for those of you who are doing a bachelor's degree right now in university. This is a really great way for you to be able to earn credits towards your degree and also potentially save money on tuition from our various study abroad scholarships. Right now, all of our study abroad opportunities are virtual. So if this is something you would like to join, please also send us an email. We'd love to be able to share more information with you. You can check out some of our partner universities on our website. Our website is listed down there at csosummer.org. You can check out a few of our destinations and our partner universities. Some of them are not on our website just yet. So if there's a specific country that you're interested in learning more about, you can also ask us about that. Another thing we're excited to share with you guys is a virtual faculty-led program, and this year we'll be focusing on entrepreneurship. So if you are interested in starting up a business and you'd like to learn more about managing a business and you'd like to be able to learn from business owners and attend workshops, this is something that you might be interested to join, so please don't hesitate to reach out to us about that. We also do provide master's programs, so if you are interested, we've been receiving a lot of requests and to have more information on that. So that's really great news, and we'd love to share more information with you for those of you who are looking to do an MBA or another master's program in a different subject. We do provide partial scholarships and as well as academic support for those of you who are considering any of our products or services. And just here are some of our different social media outlets and channels that you can connect with us on. Please don't hesitate. We'd love to connect with you and share more updates and news with you as they come along. So you can feel free to take a picture of the screen and join us after the webinar. And now to introduce our guest speaker for today. Dr. Andrea Baldini is an associate professor for the School of Arts at Nanjing University in China and director of the NJU Center for Sino-Italian Cultural Studies. He is also young ambassador of the Jiangsu provincial government. Dr. Baldini holds a PhD in philosophy from Temple University in Philadelphia and a PhD in text sciences from the University of Siena. His areas of specialization and competence include aesthetics, art theory, critical theory, urban communication, art and law, heritage and museum studies, comparative philosophy, and history of art, musicology, and history of music. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to our guest speaker for today. Welcome again, and I hope you guys all enjoy today's webinar on philosophy and life.
Thank you very much, Esther and Shane. I'm very pleased to be here. It's always nice to be able to talk philosophy and, here. It's always nice to be with the friends at CSO. And thanks to everybody for joining us. You're a lot of people. It might be actually the largest, maybe the largest webinar I did, at least by myself, by like solo show by all means. So it's interesting. So today we are going to talk about a sort of very fundamental question about our lives as humans. We're going to ask a question about the meaning of life. Now, we're going to do it by looking at an example from popular culture. Usually this is something that I do, especially when I work at, undergraduate level, or that I like to do even more upper level courses. But it's interesting to me to connect with my students with a little bit of popular culture, because philosophy has this bad name of being, very abstruse and something very distant from our daily lives. It's often accused of being actually abstract and irrelevant. Now, there is a truth to that, in the sense that many philosophers gave philosophy a bad name. If I can quote, I don't know if you're familiar with I think it's John Bon Jovi. It's Bon Jovi, it was a famous song. You give name a love a bad name. So philosophers gave to philosophy a bad name because a lot of the work that we have been hearing in the last, maybe 100 years, maybe even more, they seem to be completely disconnected from everyday reality. Whereas actually philosophy historically starts as a reflection on everyday life. Philosophers at the beginning of the history of Western philosophy were interested in questions that interest all of us. What does it mean to be happy? What's happiness? What's the meaning of life? What does it mean to be a good person? So, by using this example, and in this case, I'm using Dr. House, I'd like to, show you how much we do constantly philosophy in one sense, in the sense that wants to capture the fact that thinking about philosophical problems is a natural disposition of humans. You do it constantly, you just don't realize it. Now, on the other hand, you might not do philosophy in a more technical sense that tries to capture the idea that philosophy as a particular way of assessing arguments, developing reasons, and trying to answer very fundamental questions. Now, I hope that a lot of you are familiar with Dr. House. I realized that actually it was popular a long time ago. It was popular when I was young. So I always loved it. And it's a very, very philosophical show. So if you're not familiar, this is, take the chance, and after the webinar, just watch the series. I think there's 7 series. It's marvelous. Most of my students have as some of their assignments watching actually TV shows, because again, it doesn't really matter what what you're thinking, what you used to think about philosophical problems. You don't need fancy books or fancy language. Sometimes a TV show is what you need. It's just what you need. So we're going to ask the question related to the meaning of life by looking at why Dr. House actually cures his patients. Why? Because actually, as we will see, Dr. House is this sort of very harsh character. He seems really not to care about anybody. So it is in some senses puzzling for people watching the show. The reasons why he actually is a doctor. So why he wants to save lives. If he thinks that actually lives is at the end of the day has no meaning. So here is the kind of thing that we do as philosophers. So the question I want to start with is that does philosophy, does life have a objective meaning? Now, this is very confusing because actually, do you see the pop-up questions like the polls when I see them, or maybe you don't? So here is, the question is very tricky because it seems to be very difficult to find a definitive, a unique answer. And this is a typical trait of philosophical questions, because philosophical questions are very fundamental. They ask something about very basic aspects of our lives. And in this sense, you can't find what you might want to call empirical answers. What are empirical answers? They are answers, for instance, that you might find actually in the natural sciences. So here I'm, contrasting, for example, the idea of finding meaning with discovering the law of gravity. So the idea is that when you discover the law of gravity, what you're doing is that you are observing reality. Reality, in some senses, it tells you something. It shows you the way in which it works. And then you actually find the answer, of, for instance, to the question, why do things fall? Now you discover that, and that's to some extent the definitive answer. It's an empirical answer. It's just the way it is. But when you think about finding meaning, you're tackling with something very different. Because the point is that we have no way in which we can find meaning outside of the window or in the parking lot or in the garage or in the sky. Meaning is partly constituted by the very way in which we think about it. So meaning, like many of the fundamental aspects of human lives, are constituted by the very activity that humans actually carry out. And in this sense, by answering the question, we create partly the answer. In this sense, it is very important to actually learn how to think philosophically, because philosophy is the discipline that allows you to actually deal with these very difficult and basic questions and to develop answers. They are not just interesting, but they are reasonable. And what does it mean to be reasonable? That they are actually, they are justified in some senses. Now, it's very difficult to define once and for all what is a justification, even in philosophy. But here we will see some ways in which philosophy, or in general philosophers, argue about the answers that one can actually give to the question of what's the meaning of life. Now, here it's what we're going to do. So in general, in philosophy, you find basically, or in the history of Western thought, you might say, you find three ways of answer to the question, what is, does life have meaning, or what's the meaning of life? So some actually claim, as I think 16% of you said, that basically life has no meaning. Part of basically of thinkers in the history of Western philosophy argue that the meaning of life comes from actually God. So here is a way of connecting basically religion to the meaning of life and the very existence of God. And in the last part of the lecture, we're going to look at the possibility of reconciling what we're going to call subjective and objective meaningfulness. So here you start to see actually what usually philosophers do, which is something that has to do with this, drawing distinctions, because natural language is very ambiguous, and thankfully so, because it allows us to talk about many things. But when we think about these questions, a very important aspect is actually to become able to understand the different meanings that we are playing with. Now here, what's the answer for question number 2? God. So we have a lot of religious people, I guess. Now, I guess that you're not going to like Dr. House, because actually Dr. House tended to be, at least in many episodes, or at least in many occasions when he thinks or discusses the meaning of life, it tends, or at least he appears to be, an nihilist. Dr. House embraces these scientific views of basically human nature, and according to this view, basically humans are just animals. So we're selfish-based animals crawling across the earth. That's how Dr. House would define humans. in one of the episodes. And in this sense, it seems that you were here as an ant will be here, or a tree. So there is really nothing that is profoundly meaningful about our existence. And in this sense, it seems to suggest something like a form of nihilism. Nihilism, it's generally connected to moral philosophy. And nihilists like Nietzsche were, philosophers or thinkers that believe that actually morality is just a pure invention and nothing is actually morally wrong. The morality is simply the law of the strongest. So that those in power are those that are actually capable of determining what morality is. But there is, in other occasions during the show, there are moments where Dr. House actually seems to go against this idea that life has no meaning. Because in moments where he starts to talk to his patients, he actually finds despicable to trick them, or actually to persuade them to, for instance, follow a treatment by lying to them. And so he has like this very, very strong moral sense that allows him to distinguish between right actions and wrong actions. And so he often says about his patients something along the following: it shouldn't be making a decision based on a lie. Misery is better than nothing. So it seems that just with these few words, Dr. House is sketching a picture of what is to live a meaningful life. For instance, it is to live a life that is not based on a lie, where truthfulness, for instance, appears as an aspect of one's life that makes it meaningful. But in many episodes, actually, as I mentioned, Dr. House tries to debunk the idea that meaning in life comes from religion. This is a very traditional answer that has been given for, I would say, millennia in the history of Western philosophy and the theology, at least basically until Kant. So it's late 18th century. So Kant writes his last work, I think, in 1790. So here is a way in which you actually construe an argument in favor of the idea that meaning comes from God and religion. So generally, there are two ways of construing this argument. The first argument is to say that human life is meaningful because it actually follows and fulfills God's plan. And in this sense, the source of the meaningfulness of one's life comes from God. The other version of this idea is to say that actually it's the plan that is intrinsically meaningful. So I hope you see the distinction here. One way is just God that is the source of meaning. So whatever goes, however God designed the plan, it's okay, because that's God that provides the plan with meaning. The other way is to say, well, God designed a plan that is actually meaningful per se. The other big argument defending views that sees in basically religion and the existence of God a way to understand what is to live a meaningful life has to do with the immortality of the soul. The idea of the immortality of the soul is, grounds many, important religion, including, of course, Christian religions, so Christianity. So the idea is that your life is meaningful insofar as it prepares you actually to go somewhere else, which is very nice, which is heaven, which is the idea of the afterlife. So whatever you do here acquires meaning insofar as will allow you to go to heaven, which is the ultimate place of happiness, at least according to the Christians. Now here in many episodes, actually, Dr. House works out rejections, criticisms of these views. So when we think about the first version of the idea that life's meaning comes from God, and in particular, from God's plan, what Dr. House will say is that then if there is something about the plan that is meaningful just because God made it, then the plan is actually arbitrary. And it's difficult to see how something arbitrary is meaningful. It is very bizarre to actually think that you might want to call a plan meaningful that has been decided in ways that are completely arbitrary, that is completely random. It seems that when we think about the meaningfulness of life, we think about something more profound, something that is a source of some kind of positivity. What if God's plans is just about the destruction of humanity, suffering, and wars? That could be God's plan. Now, of course, many in the history of Western philosophy, especially philosophy, and theology, have answered this objection by saying, well, listen, actually, God makes a good plan. That's because God is maximally good, and so He makes a plan. He designs a plan that is intrinsically meaningful. But here is what Dr. House says when he's faced with this reply. Well, then the meaningfulness of one's life has nothing to do with God. It has to do with actually how the plans unfolds. And so how one's life unfolds. So meaningfulness can be explained, understood, and looked at, even in the absence of consideration of God's role in it. So here is the other aspect, so the mortality of the soul. So the idea, as I mentioned before, is that life is meaningful because it leads us somewhere else, which is basically heaven, which is the happiest place ever. Now here is the scientism of Dr. House often enters into the picture, and he says, well, we have no evidence that there is an afterlife, so it's a huge gamble to actually rely your idea of the meaningfulness of life on something you have no evidence for. But there is another aspect that is also interesting. If the meaning comes from the afterlife, then this life has no meaning. And of course, this creates a paradox. So why would you, and of course, why would you want to live this life if the only thing that actually matters is to actually die and go somewhere else? These are, traditional ways of discussing the meaning of life in relationship to religion. But here is, something that actually Dr. House, at least implicitly, tries to depict or to defend. And it's an idea of developing a theory of the meaning of life that actually does not depend on a supernatural being. Human reason is very limited. And of course, as soon as we start talking about a supernatural being, we actually lose the possibility, basically, of arguing in terms of something rational. Because, of course, God, by definition, is beyond reason. It can't be proven. It just has to be believed in. And that's the very idea of faith. So here is, a series of distinctions that are useful in order to understand how we can talk about the meaning of life outside of, theological, that is a religious picture. So there is a sense in which we talk about, meaningfulness as something that has a meaning in subjective terms. Now, here is very important, and this is, key of philosophy. If you want to understand what the philosophers mostly do, try to understand what I'm going to, pay attention to what I'm going to say. Subjective is one of those terms that is a philosophical nightmare because it means many different things. Sometimes we think about subjective in terms of arbitrary. It is a subjective, so everyone has its own or her own view about it. But there is another sense in which the subjective has to do with the subject. And it need not actually be arbitrary. Now, your pain, it is a subjective. If you actually take a needle and you make a hole in your hand, I'm not going to feel it. So pain is a subjective. It relates only to the subject that actually experiences the pain. But on the other hand, if you actually are in pain, you will be very much against the idea that your pain is arbitrary, even if you are the only person that actually perceives it. Now, meaningfulness can have this very quality of being subjective. That is, it is a way in which we feel about our actions. This thing that I have just done is meaningful to me. Now here, for instance, I can tell you, now I'm here, I'm talking about the meaning of life, and the very act of actually teaching is meaningful to me. It feels meaningful. But here is the problem. Now, you might actually experience a feeling of, so to say, satisfaction that something is meaningful when actually experiencing or getting all sorts of things. But there are at least some cases, if not many cases, where we want something that is either trivial or irrational or even evil. And it is, it's very strange to say that, life is meaningful when somebody actually gets satisfaction out of doing something very evil. For instance, we know, as a matter of fact, the serial killers or sociopaths, they actually get pleasure out of inflicting pain to others. Now, there might actually, when they inflict pain to others, the actions that they do, they might actually feel subjectively meaningful. But we would resist the idea that they are objectively meaningful. They seem to be awful, just awful. And we will, I think that most of us will actually be very skeptical about finding a life of inflicting pain to others as a meaningful one. And then there, in order to counteract this idea, we can think about meaningfulness again in some kind of objective terms, which again, in this case, again, it means something along the following lines. It's something that we recognize outside of the feelings of the individual. Now, when we think about meaningfulness in objective terms, we can say that meaningfulness depends on how our actions, for instance, affect others. Now, here, though, it's interesting because actually you might actually perform an action that saves millions of lives, but deep inside yourself, you don't feel actually that what you have done is meaningful, but you still feel miserable. So for instance, Dr. House is a perfect example of this. He's a miserable person, always, every time in the show, he feels miserable, it's nasty, he's always dissatisfied, in spite of the fact that he constantly saves lives. Why? Because here you see that we have subjective meaningfulness and objective meaningfulness that often is separated, or at least in principle, they can be separated. You can be a great person, but still feel very bad about yourself. So the conundrum is basically to get subjective meaningfulness and objective meaningfulness together. So how can we think about a way of understanding the meaning of life that can bring together subjective meaningfulness and objective meaningfulness? Now, of course, this is a very complicated question, and I'm just going to sketch for you an answer. It is an answer that actually depends on the views of a very famous philosopher, that is Aristotle, was actually a student of Plato, lived in ancient Greece. Now, Aristotle thought about beings in general in terms of their functions. So the idea is that what you are is defined by the very specific function that only you have as a member of a particular species. Now, for Aristotle, the very function that defines the essence of human beings is their rationality. Man, according to Aristotle, is the only rational animal, which means that only humans have the capacity for reasoning. Now, for Aristotle, will tell you that persons that are not using reason are not realizing their potential as humans. So they are failing at fulfilling, in important senses, their very nature as humans. Now, here is how we can connect Aristotle and Dr. House. Aristotle, but which also, the view of Aristotle, which also informs what often Dr. House will say, is that a life without reason and curiosity is a life that actually is not worth living. So, and the idea is that in the very exercise of reason, we actually feel good. We actually can fulfill our very essence as human beings, while at the same time performing actions that are actually also objectively meaningful. We can save lives, we can invent things that are useful, we can educate people, we can help others, we can build great things and find new ways to be together in peaceful ways, in ways that allow humans to actually prosper. And so here is the idea of the examined life, which is the idea of a life that is capable of reconciling objective and subjective meaningfulness. So when you exercise reason, it feels good about yourself, and at the same time, you do the things you ought to do. You're exercising the proper function as a human being. So here is, we're getting to our conclusion. So we've been talking about philosophy and how philosophy is the discipline that deals with these fundamental questions about human life. Questions we can't answer by just looking at the word as the word is, but they are questions that require reasoning. Now, we've been looking at a particular question that has been interesting, has been of interest for philosophers since its very beginning. What is the meaning of life? And we've looked at how, through Dr. Zhao's show, we can see different perspectives and approaches. For instance, nihilism, which denies that life has a meaning. And then we've been looking at the religious pictures according to which either God's plan, or the immortality of the soul provides our lives with meaning. And at the end, we have been looking into a model that tries to create, or at least argue for, a way of understanding meaning outside of any theological picture. A model that actually tries to reconcile what we've been calling subjective meaningfulness and objective meaningfulness. Now, the whole point of this class, of this webinar, it is actually to say that philosophy has a profound value for your daily lives, not because it will give you a job or because it will, give you money, but because of the very foundation of our nature as human beings. That is, our nature as rational beings. And as here you see this very beautiful painting. This is actually Socrates right before taking the poison, because he refused to actually abide, to go against his reason. Because at the end of the day, a non-examined life is not worth living. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the presentation. So we're going to just take a few questions now.
Ooh, lots of questions.
There's a lot of questions. We probably won't have time to get to all of them. So let's just start with, the first question here is, how to have a positive philosophy about life given negative circumstances?
Oh, I saw that. Actually, this is very pressing questions because, of course, we're all living in a very difficult situation. But again, there are two things I want to say. So there's a sense in which the question trades on an ambiguity about philosophy. So sometimes we talk about philosophy as the discipline I mentioned, and sometimes we talk about philosophy as the take we have on things. No, it's not that one has to, ignore one or the other. But what we do here is a little different. So the point is that, philosophy doesn't want you to have a positive, to be positive about things necessarily. But the idea is to be clear about things. And there is a sense in which when Dr. Hauser says you don't want to live in a lie, he says there's something that I would say most philosophers will agree with. The sense what philosophy can do in these moments of difficulty is trying to understand where the difficulty comes from. And usually when you understand where the difficulty comes from, then you can find a solution. You might not be able to solve the problem that creates the initial issue. So I'm a philosopher. I'll never be able to find a vaccine against the coronavirus. But that doesn't mean that we can't have fulfilling lives, even under the present circumstances. The circumstances of human lives are always terrible. We live to die. We are born to die. Our lives is necessarily tragic. But the point is that once you accept that you understand that the meaning of life is in everything that you do, because every moment becomes so precious because you understand that you're going to die. And to me, this is always the liberating power of philosophy. Philosophy doesn't want to give you an answer that suits you. Doesn't tell you what you want to hear. Perhaps it gives you it paints a very dark picture of what human life is. But in telling the truth, it gives you a way to actually understand your own life and make something about it.
And the next question here is, how is philosophy different from religion?
Well, there is a very essential difference. Religion is based on faith, and philosophy is based on reason. You believe in God. If you're a Christian, for instance, I'm going to talk about Christianity just because I'm familiar with it. I was born in Italy. My mother is actually a religion teacher, and she's very, very, very religious. There is a passage in the New Testament where Jesus actually says, after his resurrection, they are blessed are those who believe without seeing. Faith is to believe against all empirical evidence. That's the very definition of what it means to be a believer. Philosophy is exactly the opposite. Philosophy actually is based on reason. It's based on rationality. And, for many centuries, philosophers have tried, for instance, to justify with reason or to prove with reason the existence of God. That actually has created the secular society in the Western world, because they finally realized that there was no way in which you can prove rationally the existence of a supernatural being that lives outside this time and space, and it's immortal, he sees the world in its infinity, and so forth and so on. So philosophy, though it deals with questions, they are usually also of interest of religions. It does it with a very different attitude and with very different methodology and principles.
And the next question here is, do you believe that there is some sort of biological connection between parents and their children, and how the ethical values of parents influence children as they turn or grow into adults?
This is, there is a sense in which this seems to be, at least the first part of the question, seems to be an empirical question. So it's something you might want to ask to a scientist. It seems to me, as a non-scientist, it seems obvious to me that there is a connection, because hormones and the ways in which we have been selected, you key into your children. Most of the times, there are cases in which actually this doesn't happen. And for instance, for mothers, it's called, postnatal depression. So one of the symptoms is that the mother doesn't actually connect with the child. But, like even anecdotal evidence, people will tell you that they will do anything about their children. And I mean, I do believe that. My mother, when actually she gave birth to me, she risked to die. And she knew it, but she did it anyway. And then she didn't even see me because I wasn't even born. Whether now the connection with the ethical principles, so there is a sense in which, of course, contingently, you get used to the values of the society in which you are born. And of course, family, at least in many contexts, are the main way in which you actually shape your personality, or at least one of the main ways. So of course, if your parents have certain ethical views, that might actually shape the ways in which you see right and wrong. But this is something I always assign. There is something magical about humans, because it doesn't matter how you basically raise a person, that individual has always the possibility, at least to some extent, to overcome whatever he or she has been taught. In the sense, you're not determined by your family. And this seems to be, to me, the greatest aspect, the greatest miracle, one of the greatest miracles of human life, because it doesn't matter how awful you have been treated, you can always become something better. It doesn't matter how, how racist is the society you have been raised in, you can always step outside of it. It might actually be very difficult, but I will never believe that you are determined to be what you have been told to be, because history is just a very, very, very long series of exceptions to the norm. That's how we became who we are as humans.
Our next question, do you believe that philosophy can save humanity?
No, there is a sense in which I would say no. In the sense that I don't think that the discipline of philosophy has some special status with respect to others. Of course, it can help us. And I think that primarily, and I'm going to stress this, all my colleagues, they're going to listen to this, I'm going to hate me more than they usually do. I think that it's mostly philosophers' fault, because philosophers, out of the decreasing prestige that they had historically, they started to basically close up their discipline to to the word. So I don't think the philosophy can save humanity, but I think that philosophy can actually play a role in bettering society. I'll give you an example, which is a very interesting example to me, very pressing for everybody. So most people actually are familiar with some of the choices that doctors had to take in ICU units. So when you don't have enough ventilators, you have to choose you're going to save. Now, what are the reasons that actually will lead a doctor to save one person instead of another's? Now, these are they're partly scientific reasons. Because of course, assessing a person's health, it's a very complicated thing that it's not purely medical. It has to do with many kinds of considerations, hierarchies on values, and so forth and so on. Now, there is something, to me, very puzzling, is that in spite of how many programs of ethics we have, the guidelines for these particular kind of selections are super rough. Like nobody ever worked on them. Now, if a philosophy or philosophers perhaps would dedicate more time to questions like that, then you might actually find better ways of dealing with, for instance, the selections of patients. But actually, even think about policies of public health in the case of a pandemic. The point is that, of course, there must be some scientific knowledge that can ground what you do. But the point, like in a case where, like COVID-19, where you have no scientific knowledge because nobody actually knows how it works, then you need prudential reasons, and prudential reasons are the domain of philosophy. But again, we had no idea how to deal with that. So there is a sense in which philosophy can help us, but can't save us by itself.
Next question is a little bit longer, so I will try to make it clearer so that you can keep track. But essentially it says here, Plato says philosophy is superior than aesthetics such as poetry, as philosophy deals with the ideas of universality, as according to him, idea is to be the ultimate reality of life, whereas Aristotle mentions philosophy endeavors to discover the universal in the particular, and poetry represents the particular through the particular. As a philosopher, what is your viewpoint regarding these legend philosophers?
Oh, so you open a can of worms. Well, I think Plato is by all means the greatest philosophers of the Western tradition. I mean, we used to say that everybody wrote after Plato just wrote footnotes to what Plato said. Now, Plato was very skeptical about the power of the arts, and for very good reasons, because the arts are very powerful. He also was a person who lived across a trauma that actually shaped his views about reality. I mean, Plato couldn't make sense of why Socrates was, forced to death. He was condemned to death. Why he was thinking that actually Socrates was the best person in Athens. So the metaphysics that actually Plato builds, it's an attempt to make sense of how the world is bad and there is an ideal situation that is actually good. As philosophically intriguing and powerful as it is, I think that Plato's system is just crazy. I mean, to think that there is a reality outside of reality, I don't see how that's even remotely possible. That, what a chair is, it's a function of the fact it participates or, embodies an idea of what is to be a chair. I think that the word, for good or for bad, it's much simpler. It's what we have. And so there is a sense in which, the ideas that the Plato defends are, very, very problematic to be applied in our everyday lives. And there is a sense in which why many people think that philosophy is useless. Aristotle had, on the contrary, a much more practical view about the world. Aristotle, for many, is basically the individual, the thinker, who provide us with the most fundamental ideas that will develop into science, and what we have today as science. And so, Aristotle, for a person that at least has my philosophical sensibility, is always saying something more interesting, because it's more interested in seeing how things actually work in the world, and he has, a very, way less rigid way of understanding the relationships between ideas and the world. So, yeah, sort of kind of that. But there is a sense that, let me add one point. There is a tendency when people start a philosophy to refer constantly to the great thinkers from the past. And I think this is something that kills the discipline all the time, in the sense we should pay respect to them. But if philosophy becomes just a comment to those who have written before us, then it becomes pointless. I mean, what could Aristotle say about something like a pandemic? Like a COVID-19. Can you find something meaningful in what he said? Maybe here and there. But I think, the challenge of philosophy is to do philosophy and to actually train every one of us to be a philosopher. You don't need a specialized individual to deal with philosophy.
Our next question, who determines how real is reality? Because we define our situation, we impute meaning to the so-called reality out there.
So I'm not sure about the first part. So if it relates to the, some form of skepticism. So the idea is that we do know what real is real. It is a huge question. I mean, of course, we might actually be living in a dream, or, like reality could be just a shade, it could be in the matrix. It seems increasingly, I must admit, problematic to actually defend forms of radical skepticism. And at least in the sense in which we really can have a clue that we are alive, or that, others are there. There is a sense in which, of course, it's very difficult to understand what is real. I mean, if you think about quantum physics, now it seems that actually reality is everything but what we think it is. That there are no objects, everything is a particle. You take these, you think these are objects, but actually they're particles, and there are a lot of holes between them. And then there is a continuum of time and space, and everything is very bizarre. And that seems to be a reality in the most real sense of the term. So that what the word is, it's the quantum word, which is very different from what we perceive. So it's it's a huge question, and I mean I think nobody has the answer yet. Of course, there is a sense in which we act in the world as if the world is real. In the sense, if you love a child, if you have a child and you love that child, the idea that that child is not real is never going to cross your mind when you act in the world. Now, when we think about meaning and value, all of these things are, of course, imputed by human beings. They are not there as maybe like as the mountains are there or the sea is there. So it's a different way in which we talk about what is real. Values are not real in the same sense in which, again, an atom of carbon is real, but that doesn't mean they do not exist. Of course, this is the paradox of human existence, and that's why we have philosophy, because in spite of the fact that they do not exist independently of human existence or human life or human culture, they still play such a huge role. We will die for values. You will die for freedom. I mean, people have been dying for freedom since the dawn of times. They've been dying for love since the dawn of time. And actually, seems the only plausible way of doing is to live, for instance, your life to serve those you love, or to serve the country. For even countries, countries don't exist. But if you say to somebody that fought, for instance, for the independence of Italy, that Italy actually doesn't exist, it's not real, you might not have good, find a very sympathetic interlocutor. Because of course these things exist. They are even, in philosophy we say causally efficacious. They change the world. But of course, they exist in a different way.
And I think this will be our last question for today. So we don't have time to get to all of them. We
have 66 questions. Liu, for those of you who are Chinese.
So the last question for today, just with respect to life, why do some religions believe in reincarnation?
That's a very good question. I don't know. I don't know. This is, it's a question for, for people who talk about religion, more, for religious scholars more than philosophers. But here is, maybe you gotta, maybe I'll give you my idea, which is one of the reasons why I'm interested in philosophy. Because without trying to be disrespectful, is that life is such a mess. Life is so complicated And to some extent, it's such a miracle that we try to find a way to explain what's happened to us. I mean, why are we conscious? Nothing is conscious in the way in which we are. I mean, of course, animals are, we have, we don't need to embrace, sort of views according to which we're so special. We're not so special. Of course, animals have feelings. If you ever had a dog or a cat, or even a parrot or whatever, I don't know what you did, a turtle. Of course, these things, they have feelings, and they have a mental life, very plausibly. But humans, they have even language in a way in which other species don't, at least as far as we understand. And we try to to make sense of our place in the universe. And a lot of times we just try to make sense of it by inventing very puzzling, even more puzzling realities, because perhaps, the naked truth is very difficult to be accepted. And it's actually one of the things I've already said, that we're born to die. This is a very scary thought. That and it's a paradox. It seems a contradiction. You might say, why is something that is born designed to die? Why to be born in the beginning? So why does life exist if it involves death? I don't think we have, and we will never have an answer to that. I mean, it seems to me just the way things are. And it's a paradox that we have to carry. But we don't, my point is that we don't need to invent something particularly charming to please us, or to actually cover up the tragic aspect of human life. Because in the moment in which we accept this our tragic fate, then we can actually find happiness in the moments that we're given.
All right, so I think we will end the questions here. So thank you everyone again